All right, my name's Gord Sleevert. I'm with Canadian Sports Centre Pacific, and I'm here to interview Dr. Trent Stellingwerff, Senior Physiologist with CSC Pacific. And today we're going to be talking about recovery. In particular, we are going to revisit some of the previous points that have been covered in the Performance Point series on recovery, as new data has been rapidly emerging over the last couple of years. So good morning, Trent.
Good morning. It's nice to be here.
All right. Well, let's start by perhaps putting recovery into perspective. And I think most coaches and sports scientists will automatically think about the adaptation curve when they think about recovery. So we train, we fatigue, we recover, and hopefully we adapt to that training and are faster or fitter.
Yep.
Trent, what importance do you put on recovery, or do you think coaches should be putting on recovery as an essential part of training adaptation?
Yeah, that's a good spot to start, and it's probably, if you ask 100 coaches, you get 100 different definitions of what their thought is on recovery. And maybe one simple way to think about it is just the active process of going back to normal.
Right.
And so recovery could just be the time space during interval training that you allow the athlete to go slightly back towards normal so they can do another interval.
So 3 minutes hard, 3 minutes easy, whatever it is.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
What we're getting at today is that process in minutes to hours to a couple of days in terms of acute recovery, which probably has a couple phases, which I think we'll get into. And how can we optimize that so to allow the athlete to either get more hard training sessions in a week, so to decrease recovery time between hard training, or to amplify the response of a given training bout to allow for better supercompensation.
Right. Okay.
So obviously, if you can decrease recovery time, you can get more hard training bouts in a given period. Or if you can amplify the stimulus of the training over time, adaptation should occur more rapidly and to more desired effects.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent description of essentially how we as physiologists put recovery in perspective with all of the other training stimuli that an athlete might be exposed to. I think an interesting discussion that we recently had was in and around how much of an athlete's life is spent recovering from training versus actually training. And I think, maybe you could comment on that. Because it does put the importance of recovery into perspective, I think.
So I did a quick calculation for a conference we were at a few months ago that kind of prefaced this whole performance point. And I looked at, I had some data on elite athletes training, a middle distance runner. And I looked at the number of minutes she breathes in a year and what percent of time was spent training. And for most elite athletes, that's between about 6 and 10% of every minute they're alive in a year is spent training. So that leaves about 95% or 90 to 95% on recovery with big quotes.
Right.
Meaning every life decision an athlete may make that will enhance, be neutral, or deter from the training stimulus.
So what they eat, what they drink, what their lifestyle is, how they sleep.
Yeah. Whether they're up playing video games to 2 a.m.
Right.
or getting to bed by 9:30. So.
Right.
It's something like 500,000 minutes left over in the year that is spent outside training, and so when you get your head wrapped around that, and then obviously the percent of time spent competing is incredibly small. In a quad, it's 0.00019%.
Right.
And so coaches have to start to think about being experts in the training stimulus, but also becoming more and more aware of being experts in the recovery stimulus as well.
Absolutely. 500,000 minutes is a lot of minutes.
Yeah.
So, I think that puts recovery in perspective for sure, and certainly highlights that it can have a major impact on obviously the training response and the performance level of an athlete. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what precedes recovery and how to think about, when you train, you fatigue, what actually happens during that fatigue response, and then how do you target more of a proactive recovery strategy to, I guess, remove that fatigue or perhaps enhance adaptation. So perhaps, Trent, we could talk about the fatigue curve that happens with training, and then the second part of that fatigue curve that maybe happens in those minutes to hours after you've stopped training.
So, yeah, it's a great concept, and it's a concept that a lot of younger athletes or younger coaches maybe don't totally grasp, because they think, okay, I train hard to run faster or jump higher or whatever the sport dictates. But after a very hard workout, no athletes in most situations are going to set a new personal best, because that recovery cycles are missing. So training's catabolic, it's fatiguing, and to get the benefits out of training, you have to think about using recovery effectively. And so there's probably two parts to the fatigue process, or to the fatigue curve. An early exercise stress kind of fatiguing part, which includes depletion of energy stores, so say phosphocreatine, glycogen. It includes muscle damage. It might include hyperthermia, so overheating, or hypohydration, so dehydration. And those are all pretty acute things that can be rectified through hydration and nutrition in the order of hours to 24 hours.
So those are all things that occur while training is occurring. They're gradually depleting, yes. Gradually accruing.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the second phase of that is somewhere on the order of immediately post-training to, it could be 24, 48, or even 72 hours later, where you get post-exercise stress, and that's where inflammation starts to come in, oxidative stress from the training itself, and prolonged muscle damage, and even this mythical CNS fatigue, central nervous system fatigue.
Right.
And if you have a world-class sprinter do a very high-quality speed workout, it might take them 3, 4, 5 days before they kind of feel normal again, because of how demanding it was on the central nervous system. So an endurance athlete that does a long run or a hard ride, they have, say, metabolic fatigue in terms of decreased glycogen depletion. They can bounce back 24 hours later.
Sure.
But with the CNS fatigue, the recovery profile is a lot longer.
Well, I think that's a great way to look at fatigue if you're a coach or a scientist, at this sort of two-phased approach. What happens during the training, and then reinforcing the idea that even after you've stopped training, there are still things happening physiologically that may bring you down to a lower performance level for a while. And you mentioned post-exercise, the inflammatory response, which obviously the immune system becomes part of that, and that can cause further muscle damage. So the idea that I train and now I recover is, we have to think about, obviously, Trent, what we're doing in our recovery. Are we targeting what happened during the training? Is that what we're really targeting with recovery? Or are we targeting, in addition to that, some of the post-training or post-exercise stressors or fatigue processes that have happened?
No, it's a good point, and it's not black and white. It's not a light switch. It's a continuum.
It's a continuum,
And so with all continuums, it's a little more complex than because you can take in carbohydrate post-training to replenish glycogen, but you can also consider to take in, say, high-dose antioxidants to decrease oxidative stress, which occurs, say, 24 or 48 hours later.
Right.
But there's now pretty good research that suggests, well, for elite athletes, you may not, for endurance athletes at least, you may not want to do that.
Right. I mean, I guess that the whole purpose of training is to stress the system, create a stimulus that causes adaptation. If you're too aggressive, perhaps, with recovery, so you're reducing that stress, then I guess, and there's some good literature, as you mentioned now, or there's some targeted literature, I wouldn't say it's broad, but that would suggest that actually an overly aggressive recovery that's not well thought out could actually blunt adaptation and blunt the training response. So we have two possibilities here. You can proactively recover to enhance training and performance, and you can proactively recover, and in fact, you could blunt the response. So now that gets really confusing for a practitioner going, well, should I recover or shouldn't I? And maybe we can explore that a little.
Yeah, sure. I think if you think of, again, a continuum and then two sides of the continuum, I think that there's times where you really need to emphasize recovery, and there may be other times when you de-emphasize it, strategically de-emphasize it, and calculate it. And when I think of those two sides of the continuum, maybe on the times that you always emphasize recovery are in young and developing athletes, because they're still on a high adaptation improvement curve. A lot of them might be developing and growing still. And athletes that need to grow muscle and need to grow mass, you always need to emphasize recovery, because you will not grow mass without eating protein and being in positive energy balance. You would really emphasize recovery in athletes that tend to get sick often, brittle athletes that break down, have immune function difficulties, whether they're young or senior or whatever. Just really emphasize recovery, and emphasize recovery coming into championship seasons.
Sure. So when you're really in that very specific preparation phase, moving right into a competition phase. So the idea of periodizing recovery, then there may be times in the general preparation phase, and coaches just get big smiles on their faces at these times, where the whole concept is, well, I'm going to break you down. We're going to train, we're going to break you down, and then we will accrue these training benefits. But the focus at that point of the training year is on not overtraining, but obviously creating repeated stresses and perturbations in the system that cause adaptation.
Completely agree. It's more high risk, but it's more high reward. And if you want an athlete to come out and really taper and have a good performance boost, especially the very elite athlete who's on the very top end of the adaptation curve, you're looking for that 0.5%.
Absolutely.
Then you need a strong hammer. You need a strong stimulus to get the adaptation. And as scientists, we call that functional overreaching.
Absolutely.
And so, if one side you have training, then you have overreaching, and then overtraining, it's targeted functional overreaching. You're stretching the athlete beyond their normal limits. It's a bit of a gray zone, an individual. Then when does functional overreaching become non-functional overreaching?
Well, we're not very good at predicting that, are we?
No.
And I guess the primary method that most practitioners have utilized in identifying overtraining, which seems to be emerging, is failure to be able to maintain intensity and volume of training. And you start to see that drops off consistently over a number of days or weeks.
I agree.
Then you probably need to insert some recovery.
My feeling, in a very vague nutshell, is during those really difficult functional overreaching during general prep phase, when you're hammering the athlete down, as long as the athlete can get up and have a pretty good performance, measurable performance in the field, on the water, in the pool, once every 10 to 14 days, it's kind of in that range. If they can, then it's okay. If they have a couple workouts that are mediocre or performances decrease, it's part of it.
That's where you want to get them, actually, isn't it?
That's where you want to break them down.
Yeah.
If you have a test and they taper a little bit and bomb it, and then bomb another one within a 2 or 3 week cycle, then that may be a red flag to say this athlete's not responding quite the way that you'd hope. Maybe you need to periodize an extra rest phase in for them, or what have you.
So I guess the other thing, just maybe to clarify, Trent, and we're talking about maybe minimizing proactive recovery strategies in a general prep phase in athletes. That doesn't mean that you might not use some recovery strategies once or twice a week.
Absolutely.
For example, you might have 2 or 3 hard days of training, bit of recovery. Could be hydrotherapy, could be something else, but it's not like you're doing it every day after every workout. I guess that's the point we're making.
That's right. And so it's athletes always are going to recover because they're going to sleep and need to eat every day. It's just how much emphasis is put on that, and how many other modalities you use in terms of hydrotherapy, massage, time spent doing recovery in combination with the training load. And so it's that balancing act.